I should have hung up the second I heard his voice. Cold, dangerous, the kind that promised violence wrapped in silk and delivered with the precision of a bullet to the skull. But my daughter was burning with fever, her small body convulsing in my arms, like she was being torn away from me by invisible hands. And desperation makes you do stupid things, reckless things, the kind of things that change the entire trajectory of your life in ways you can't even begin to understand until you're already too far gone to turn back. Like begging a stranger at 3 o'clock in the morning when the world is dark and quiet and every good person is asleep in their beds, dreaming dreams that don't involve choosing between your child's life and your own safety. Like whispering the words that would seal my fate, that would bind me to a man I'd never met, that would transform my entire existence into something unrecognizable. Please, I need help. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Let me back up. Let me tell you how a single mother working 2 dead-end jobs in Chicago's South Side ended up tangled with a man who would later admit he'd killed more people than he could count. A man whose very name made grown men pale and stumble over their words. A man who would become everything I never knew I needed and everything I should have run screaming from. My name is Mara Chen, and on that particular night, the night that would split my life into a clear before and after, I was 26 years old, exhausted down to my bones, and so desperately, achingly alone that sometimes I forgot what it felt like to have another adult care whether I lived or died. I had my daughter Lily, who was 4 years old and the absolute center of my universe. The reason I dragged myself out of bed every morning after 4 hours of sleep to work the breakfast shift at Rosie's Diner and then the overnight shift at the 24-hour convenience store on the corner of a street where gunshots were more common than birdsong. Her father, and I use that term so loosely it practically disintegrates in my mouth, had disappeared the second that little plus sign appeared on the pregnancy test, vanishing into whatever hole cowards crawl into when faced with the reality of their actions. And I hadn't heard from Ryan in 3 years, which was perfectly fine with me because men like that don't deserve to know children like Lily. Our apartment was a study in making do with nothing, in stretching every dollar until it screamed, in learning that love doesn't require money but surviving sure as hell does, and we were barely doing that. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door, arguing with her husband in rapid-fire Spanish. The heater only worked when it felt like it, and the water ran brown for the first 30 seconds every morning. But it was ours, and I'd fought tooth and nail to keep a roof over our heads even when the eviction notices started piling up like accusatory letters from a future I was desperately trying to avoid. That night started like any other. I'd come home from my diner shift around 3 in the afternoon, picked up Lily from the neighbor who watched her for practically nothing, because she had a soft heart, and remembered what it was like to struggle. Made dinner from the dollar store pasta, and the jar of sauce I'd been rationing for a week. Gave Lily a bath in our cramped bathroom, where the tiles were cracked and missing in places, read her 3 stories because she always negotiated for more, and I could never resist those big brown eyes, and tucked her into the bed we shared because our apartment was a 1-bedroom, and I'd given her the actual bedroom while I slept on the couch that had come with the place and smelled faintly of cigarettes and disappointment. I should have been heading to my overnight shift at the convenience store. Should have been pulling on my ugly polyester vest and preparing myself for 8 hours of standing behind bulletproof glass selling lottery tickets and cigarettes to people whose lives looked as desperate as mine felt. But Lily had been warm when I kissed her goodnight. Warmer than usual, and I'd pressed my hand to her forehead with that instinctive mother's knowledge that something wasn't right. By 11 o'clock, her fever had spiked to 101 degrees, and I'd given her the children's ibuprofen we had left in the medicine cabinet, watching anxiously as she tossed and turned in her little bed, her cheeks flushed pink and her breathing slightly labored. By midnight, the fever had climbed to 103, and my heart was starting to hammer in my chest with a fear that went deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. That primal terror that comes when you realize the most important person in your world might be slipping away and you're powerless to stop it. By 2 in the morning, Lily woke up screaming, her small body jerking with convulsions, her eyes rolling back in her head, and I was scrambling for my phone with shaking hands, my mind blank with panic. Every first aid lesson I'd ever half learned completely evaporating in the face of watching my daughter seize in my arms. I tried the free clinic first, but their emergency line just rang and rang, because of course it did. Because nothing in my life had ever been easy or worked the way it was supposed to. I tried the hospital, but the bored-sounding receptionist informed me that without insurance, I'd be looking at a minimum of $3,000 just for them to see her, and did I have a credit card they could put on file, and I wanted to scream that if I had $3,000, I wouldn't be living in this shithole apartment with brown water and broken heating. Lily was burning up in my arms, her fever now at 104 degrees, according to the cheap thermometer I'd bought at the dollar store, and I was crying, actually sobbing as I held her. Because what kind of mother can't afford to save her own child? What kind of world makes you choose between bankruptcy and your baby's life? That's when I called Jessica, my best friend from high school, the only person who'd stuck by me through the pregnancy and Ryan's abandonment and every struggle since, because Jessica always knew what to do, always had a solution, always had my back when the world was trying to grind me into dust. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial, my phone screen blurred by tears, Lily's screams echoing in our small apartment, and I was thinking, please, please, please pick up as the phone started to ring. Except it rang differently than Jessica's phone usually rang, and when a voice answered after 3 rings, it definitely wasn't Jessica's warm, familiar tone. "You have 30 seconds to tell me who the fuck this is and how you got this number," the voice said, and every word was like a blade wrapped in velvet. Like violence barely restrained, like danger personified, and given a voice that somehow managed to be both cold and burning hot at the same time. I should have hung up immediately, should have checked the number and realized I'd misdialed in my panic, probably hit a 7 instead of a 6 or transposed 2 digits in my fear-soaked haste. But Lily chose that moment to let out another scream, her body going rigid in my arms, and the sound that came out of my mouth was something between a sob and a wail. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Wrong number. I didn't mean to." I started, already pulling the phone away from my ear, already preparing to hang up and try again, to get it right this time, to reach Jessica and beg her to help me figure out what to do. But something broke inside me in that moment. Some dam that had been holding back 3 years of struggling alone, of making impossible choices, of being strong when I wanted to crumble, and instead of hanging up, I just started talking, the words pouring out of me like blood from a wound I didn't know I had. "Please, please, I know this is crazy and I don't know who you are and I'm sorry for calling, but my daughter, she's sick. She's so sick. And she's having a seizure and I don't have insurance. And the hospital wants $3,000. And the clinic won't answer and I don't know what to do and she's burning up and I can't lose her. I can't. She's all I have and I don't know what to do." I was rambling, incoherent, my words tripping over each other in my desperation. And there was silence on the other end of the line. Such complete and total silence that I thought maybe he'd hung up. Maybe I'd been talking to dead air, pouring my heart out to the void. Then his voice came again, and this time it was different. Still hard and dangerous, but with something else underneath. Something I couldn't quite identify. "Address. Now." Those 2 words, delivered like a command from someone who expected absolute obedience, should have terrified me. Should have made me realize I was potentially inviting a complete stranger, a stranger who answered his phone at 3 in the morning, sounding like he was ready to commit murder, into my home, into my daughter's life, into the small, fragile world I'd built for us. But terror has a funny way of recalibrating your sense of danger. And in that moment, with Lily convulsing in my arms and fever threatening to cook her brain, a threatening stranger felt less dangerous than doing nothing. So I gave him my address, rattling off the apartment number in our building that I was 3 months behind on rent for, in the neighborhood where gunshots were background noise. And then I sat there on Lily's bed, holding my seizing daughter, waiting for what would come next, and praying I hadn't just made the biggest mistake of my life. 20 minutes later, 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. 20 minutes during which I managed to get Lily's fever down to 103.5 with a lukewarm bath and every prayer I could remember from the childhood church attendance my mother had insisted on. There was a knock on my door. Not a polite tap or a gentle rap, but a solid, authoritative knock that made it clear the person on the other side expected the door to open, and quickly. I looked through the peephole with Lily wrapped in a towel in my arms, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten the sensation. The man standing in my dingy hallway looked like he'd stepped out of a different world entirely, a world where people wore suits that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, where danger and power were worn like cologne, where men commanded attention simply by existing. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his suit jacket, in a way that suggested the body underneath was all muscle and controlled violence. And even through the distorted fisheye lens of my peephole, I could see that his face was the kind of beautiful that made your stomach flip and your brain short-circuit. All sharp angles and hard lines, with a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes that even from a distance looked like they could see straight through you, to all the secrets you kept hidden. There was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a thin white line that only added to the dangerous appeal rather than detracting from it, and 2 other men flanked him, clearly bodyguards or security, or something equally ominous, which should have sent me running, but instead made me throw open the door, because if someone came with backup, surely they were here to help, right? "You called?" he said, and it wasn't a question. And his eyes went immediately to Lily in my arms, her face flushed with fever, her small body trembling. He didn't wait for an invitation, didn't ask permission, just walked into my apartment like he owned it, his presence somehow making the small space feel even smaller, and he moved directly to us with a purposefulness that suggested he was a man who always knew exactly what he was doing. "How high is the fever?" he asked, and his voice was still hard, still edged with that danger I'd heard on the phone. But there was something else now, too. Something almost gentle when he looked at Lily. 104 at its highest. 103.5 now, I managed to say, my voice shaking because I was suddenly, acutely aware that I was standing in my pajamas, ratty shorts and an oversized t-shirt with holes in it, holding my sick daughter, while a man who looked like he'd walked off a movie screen stood in my living room. He pulled out his phone, and his next words were delivered with such absolute authority that I understood immediately this was a man who expected to be obeyed without question. "Marcus, I need Dr. Volkov at this address. 10 minutes. Then he turned those steel-gray eyes on me, and I felt the full weight of his attention like a physical thing, like being caught in the sights of something predatory and powerful, and he said, "She's going to be fine. The doctor will be here soon." I should have asked who he was, should have demanded to know why a complete stranger was making calls and bringing doctors to my apartment at 3:30 in the morning, but instead I just nodded and held Lily tighter. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that I'd just invited something into my life that I would never be able to remove, that this moment was changing everything, that nothing would ever be the same. And that voice, as it turned out, was absolutely right. They say the devil comes when you're at your weakest, appearing in the moments when your defenses are down and your soul is laid bare, offering exactly what you need in exchange for something you don't yet understand you're giving away. And he came on a Tuesday wearing a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my car was worth before it died, and driving a black Mercedes that looked like it belonged in a different universe than my crumbling neighborhood, and like an idiot drunk on gratitude and confusion, and something I refused to name. I invited him in. But let me back up to that first night, to the way Dr. Volkov arrived exactly 10 minutes after the phone call like he'd materialized out of thin air, a nervous-looking man in his 60s with shaking hands and an accent thick enough to cut with a knife, carrying a medical bag that probably contained enough equipment to staff a small clinic. He examined Lily with gentle efficiency, while I hovered anxiously, and the man who'd summoned him, whose name I still didn't know, stood in the corner of my daughter's small bedroom like a dark sentinel, his presence simultaneously comforting and terrifying in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. The diagnosis was acute bronchitis, something that would have been easily treatable if I'd had insurance, if I'd had money, if I'd had any of the resources that normal people took for granted. And Dr. Volkov administered antibiotics through an IV that he set up with practiced hands, gave her fever reducers and breathing treatments, explained dosages and follow-up care in his accented English, while shooting nervous glances at the man in the corner, as if expecting to be reprimanded at any moment. Within an hour, Lily's fever had broken, dropping down to a manageable 99 degrees, and she'd fallen into a peaceful sleep that made my heart finally stop its terrified hammering, and my lungs remember how to take full breaths. I walked Dr. Volkov to the door, thanking him profusely, asking what I owed him because surely this level of care cost something. But he just shook his head and said in his thick accent, "Already paid, miss. Take care of little one." And then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness like he'd never been there at all. When I turned back to my living room, the man was standing by my kitchen counter, if you could call the 3 feet of chipped laminate that passed from my kitchen a counter. And there was an envelope sitting there, thick and white and somehow ominous in its simplicity. And when he gestured to it with one long-fingered hand, I approached it the way you might approach a coiled snake, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "For the medicine and whatever else she needs," he said, and his voice was still that perfect blend of cultured and dangerous, like an expensive whiskey with a razor blade hidden at the bottom of the glass. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, and when I saw the thick stack of $100 bills inside, when I quickly counted 50 of them, $5,000 in cash just sitting in an envelope in my apartment like it was nothing, I actually felt my knees go weak with a combination of relief and terror, and something else I couldn't name. "I can't accept this," I said, even though every practical bone in my body was screaming that I absolutely could and should accept it, that this money could pay my back rent and buy groceries and get my car fixed and give us breathing room for the first time in years. But I'd been raised with some sense of pride, some understanding that accepting large sums of money from dangerous strangers came with strings attached, invisible threads that would bind you to obligations you couldn't yet see. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and his gray eyes were like storm clouds, beautiful and threatening and utterly captivating. And there was something in his gaze that made me feel stripped bare, like he could see every struggle, every late-night crying session, every moment of desperation that had brought me to the point of calling a wrong number and begging for help. "You can, and you will," he said. And it wasn't a suggestion, or even really a command. It was simply a statement of fact. The way you might say the sky is blue, or water is wet, something so fundamental that arguing against it would be absurd. I should have argued anyway, should have pushed back, should have maintained some shred of dignity. But Lily made a small sound from her bedroom, a soft whimper that pulled at every maternal instinct I possessed, and I found myself nodding, accepting this gift or curse or whatever it was, taking the envelope and tucking it into the drawer where I kept the bills I couldn't pay, and the eviction notices I was pretending didn't exist. "Thank you," I managed to say, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd done, for the way he'd appeared out of nowhere and saved my daughter's life without asking for anything in return, without even asking my name. He moved toward the door, his movements fluid and controlled like a predator who was always aware of his body and space, always ready to strike or defend or disappear. And I thought that would be it. That he would leave and I would never see him again. That this would become one of those strange stories I told myself late at night. Proof that sometimes miracles happened even to people like me. But then I did something I still can't fully explain, something driven by exhaustion and gratitude and a loneliness so profound it made my chest ache. And I reached out and grabbed his hand, my small fingers wrapping around his larger ones, and the contact was like touching a live wire, electric and dangerous and addictive all at once. Stay, I whispered. And then, because I apparently had no self-preservation instinct whatsoever, I added, please. His eyes met mine, and I saw something flash in them, something dark and hungry and barely controlled, and his voice when he spoke was rougher than it had been, like I'd scraped away some layer of polish to reveal something raw underneath. You don't know what you're asking, sweetheart, he said, and the endearment should have sounded condescending, but instead sounded like a caress, like something intimate and dangerous. I know you helped us when no one else would, I replied, and my voice was stronger now, more certain, because whatever this was, whatever I was inviting into my life, it felt necessary in a way I couldn't articulate. He stayed until dawn, sitting in my ratty armchair that was losing stuffing from one corner, watching over us while I dozed fitfully on the couch, and Lily slept peacefully in her room. And when I woke up with weak sunlight filtering through my thin curtains, he was gone, vanished like he'd been a fever dream brought on by my own exhaustion and fear. But there on my coffee table, next to a cold cup of tea I didn't remember making, was a business card, expensive cardstock, heavy and cream-colored, with nothing on it but a phone number embossed in simple black font, no name, no company, just 10 digits that felt like both a promise and a threat. I told myself I would throw the card away, told myself that a man like that, dangerous and powerful and clearly connected to something dark, was the last thing Lily and I needed in our lives, told myself that we'd survived this long on our own and we could keep surviving, that accepting help from strangers who appeared at 3 a.m. was how people got hurt, or worse. I told myself a lot of things over the next week, repeated them like mantras while I worked my shifts at the diner and came home to Lily, who was recovering beautifully thanks to the medication Dr. Volkov had left, who asked periodically about the nice man, in a way that made my heart twist because she'd remembered his gentleness, even in her fever-addled state. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans for my noble intentions, because my car, my ancient, held together with duct tape and prayers car, finally gave up the ghost on a rainy Thursday, dying in the parking lot of the convenience store with a sound like mechanical death. And the mechanic I called quoted me $1,500 for repairs on a vehicle that was maybe worth $500 on a good day. I lost my overnight job because I couldn't make the shift without transportation, the bus routes in our neighborhood being what they were, which meant I lost half my income, which meant the eviction notice that had been looming became imminent, became a 30-day warning that might as well have been a death sentence. I stared at that business card for 3 days, picking it up and putting it down, running my fingers over the embossed numbers, imagining what would happen if I called, what strings would be attached to whatever help he might offer, because men like that didn't help people out of the goodness of their hearts. They helped because they wanted something, because they were building leverage, because kindness was just another form of currency in whatever world they inhabited. But on Sunday night, after Lily had gone to bed and I'd done the math for the 100th time and realized there was no equation that ended with us keeping our apartment, no scenario where I could make the rent and feed my daughter and keep the lights on, I found myself dialing those 10 digits, my hands shaking, my heart pounding, telling myself I was just going to ask for advice, just going to see if maybe he knew of any job opportunities, anything that could help us stay afloat. The phone rang once, just once, and then his voice was in my ear, that same dangerous velvet that had both terrified and comforted me. And he said something that made my breath catch because it implied he'd been waiting, anticipating this exact moment. I was wondering how long you'd wait, he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was pleased, that my desperation had some kind of timeline he'd been tracking. I should have hung up right then, should have recognized the manipulation inherent in that statement. But instead I found myself asking, "How did you know I'd call?" And my voice sounded small and tired even to my own ears. "Because I know what it's like to be desperate," he replied, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like honesty, like a crack in whatever armor he wore. "And because I've been keeping an eye on things, making sure you and Lily were safe. That should have creeped me out, should have sent every alarm bell ringing. But instead I felt something warm unfold in my chest. Something that whispered maybe it wasn't so bad to have someone watching out for us. Someone who cared enough to check, even if his methods were questionable and his motives were murky. I need help, I admitted, the words tasting like defeat and relief in equal measure. And then I told him everything. The car, the job, the eviction notice, the way I was drowning and couldn't see the surface anymore. "I'll be there in the morning," he said. And it still wasn't a question or an offer, but a statement of fact. And then he hung up before I could argue or change my mind or do anything except sit there with my phone in my hand, wondering what I'd just set in motion. He arrived at 8:30 the next morning, and this time he came bearing gifts like some kind of fairy godfather, expensive pastries from a bakery I couldn't afford to look at, coffee that smelled like heaven, fresh fruit that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and he set it all on my kitchen counter like it was nothing, like dropping $100 on breakfast was as natural as breathing. Lily, who had been coloring at her small table, looked up when he entered, and her face absolutely lit up with recognition and joy. And she scrambled down from her chair and ran to him with the fearlessness of children who haven't yet learned that some people are dangerous. And she held up a piece of paper with crayon scribbles that might have been a person, or might have been a very colorful blob. "I drawed you," she announced proudly, and I watched something extraordinary happen. I watched this man who radiated danger and power and barely controlled violence drop to one knee so he was at her level. And I watched his face soften in a way that transformed him from terrifying to devastating. And I watched him take that drawing like it was the Mona Lisa, studying it with serious attention that made Lily beam with pride. "This is the best drawing anyone has ever given me," he said, and his voice had lost all its hard edges, becoming something warm and genuine that made my chest ache, because this was a man who clearly didn't often allow himself to be soft. And he was being soft for my daughter. "Do you want to color with me?" Lily asked, because she was 4 and had no concept of stranger danger or appropriate behavior. And before I could intervene, before I could explain that important men in expensive suits probably didn't have time to color with random children, he was nodding and following her to her table, folding his large frame into one of her tiny chairs in a way that should have been comical but instead was somehow endearing. I stood in my kitchen, watching this dangerous stranger sit on the floor with my daughter, accepting the purple crayon she handed him, and dutifully coloring inside the lines of the princess she'd drawn. And I felt something shift in my chest, some wall I'd built to protect myself beginning to develop cracks, and I knew that I was in trouble, that this was already more complicated than a simple transaction, that whatever was happening here was going to change everything. After 20 minutes of coloring, during which Lily chattered away, and he listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, answering her questions about his favorite color, gray, which made her wrinkle her nose, and whether he liked princesses, he'd never given them much thought, but he supposed they were acceptable. He gently extricated himself and came to join me in the kitchen, where I'd been pretending to organize things that didn't need organizing, just to keep my hands busy. "We need to talk," he said. And his voice had returned to that businesslike tone, the softness he'd shown Lily carefully tucked away again. "I don't even know your name," I said, because it suddenly seemed absurd that this man had saved my daughter's life, had brought us breakfast, had colored princesses, and I didn't know what to call him. "Dante," he said, and the name fit him perfectly. Something classic and dangerous and vaguely sinful. "Dante Russo." "Mara Chen," I replied, offering my hand for a shake like this was a normal business meeting, like we were normal people having a normal interaction. His hand engulfed mine, warm and rough with calluses that suggested he knew how to use those hands for more than just signing checks, and he held on a beat longer than necessary, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a way that sent shivers up my arm and made me acutely aware of how long it had been since anyone had touched me with anything resembling tenderness. "You need money, and I can provide it," he said, releasing my hand and getting straight to the point with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I'm not a prostitute," I said immediately, because I needed to establish that boundary right away. Needed him to understand that whatever help he was offering, it couldn't come with that particular price tag. His laugh was unexpected, genuine and rich and surprised, and it transformed his face again, making him look younger and less dangerous, and so attractive it was actually unfair that one person should be allowed to look like that. "If I wanted that, sweetheart, I would have made it clear," he said, and there was amusement in his eyes now, warming the gray to something like smoke. "I'm talking about a job, a legitimate job working for me." He explained that he owned several businesses, a restaurant, a nightclub, some other ventures he didn't elaborate on, and he needed someone to manage the legitimate operations, someone clean with no connections to his world, someone who could run things efficiently while he focused on other aspects of his empire. And the way he said empire made it clear we weren't just talking about a few successful businesses. The offer was staggering. $15,000 a month, health insurance that would actually cover things, a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, security for me and Lily. And all I had to do was manage his restaurant and ask no questions about anything else, about the parts of his business that happened in shadows and back rooms and places I probably didn't want to know about. "Why me?" I asked, because surely there were hundreds of people more qualified, people with actual business experience and degrees and references that didn't include can balance 3 plates while taking orders and not crying when customers are rude. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those storm cloud eyes, and when he finally spoke, his answer was so unexpected it stole my breath. "Because when you called that night, desperate and terrified, you didn't ask who I was or what I could do to you, you just asked for help for your daughter. And when I got here and saw how you'd been living, how you'd been fighting to keep her safe and fed and happy despite having nothing, I realized you were exactly the kind of person I needed in my life," he said. And there was something raw in his voice, something that sounded almost like loneliness. "Maybe I'm tired of only doing dark things, and you and Lily, you're light, and I want to be near that even if I don't deserve it." I should have run, should have recognized this for what it was. A powerful man becoming obsessed with something he perceived as pure. A dangerous man trying to claim something innocent. A recipe for disaster that would end with me and Lily caught in crossfire we couldn't survive. But I looked at my daughter coloring happily, looked at the eviction notice on my counter, looked at this man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd said, and I heard myself whisper the word that would seal our fate. Yes. I fell in love with him the night I saw him kill a man, which should have been my first clue that I was already too far gone, that whatever sense of morality and self-preservation I'd once possessed had been eroded by 2 months of late-night conversations and lingering glances and the kind of sexual tension that made the air between us crackle like lightning before a storm. But by then it was too late to turn back. Too late to pretend I didn't feel my heart skip every time he walked into a room. Too late to deny that I'd started choosing my clothes based on what I thought he'd like. Started wearing my hair down because I'd caught him staring at it once with an expression that made heat pool low in my belly. 2 months had passed since I'd said yes to his offer. Since I'd stepped into this new life that felt like putting on someone else's skin. Someone who managed an upscale Italian restaurant called Russo's, where the cheapest entree cost more than I used to make in a day. Someone who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with working heat and clean water, and windows that actually locked. Someone whose daughter went to a good preschool where they taught her things like basic Spanish and music appreciation instead of just keeping her alive until pickup time. Lily was thriving in ways that made my heart ache with gratitude and guilt in equal measure, making friends with children whose parents were lawyers and doctors and architects, coming home with stories about field trips to museums and art projects that required supplies I never could have afforded. And every night when I tucked her into her own bed in her own room with its fresh paint and new furniture, I thought about the price of this fairy tale we were living. The restaurant had become my kingdom in a way I'd never expected. my natural inclination for organization and efficiency translating surprisingly well into managing a staff of 20, dealing with suppliers and health inspectors, and the million small crises that arose daily in the food service industry, and I was good at it. Better than good, actually. And the staff who had initially been wary of this, nobody that Dante had installed as manager, had slowly warmed to me when they realized I actually knew what I was doing and treated them with respect instead of the contempt they'd apparently experienced from previous management. The revenue had increased by 15% in my first month alone, and I'd implemented new systems for inventory and scheduling that had reduced waste and improved morale, and I could see the approval in Dante's eyes when he reviewed the numbers, could feel the weight of his pride like a physical thing. He came to the restaurant often, usually late in the evening after the dinner rush had subsided and the kitchen was winding down, and he'd sit in his office, a sleek, modern space on the second floor that overlooked the dining room through one-way glass, and he'd call me up to discuss business, to review numbers and talk about upcoming events and plans for expansion. And these meetings that should have been purely professional had become something else entirely, something charged and dangerous and addictive. We'd start by discussing profit margins and staffing concerns, sitting on opposite sides of his massive desk like civilized business associates. But somehow we'd end up closer, the conversation drifting from work to personal topics. And I'd learn things about him in fragments. That he'd grown up in this neighborhood before it had gentrified. That his mother had made the best carbonara he'd ever tasted. That he'd built his empire from nothing through a combination of ruthlessness and strategic thinking that he described in vague terms that made it clear I didn't want details. The attraction between us had been immediate and electric from that first night, but Dante had maintained a careful distance, never crossing the professional line, never touching me beyond what was necessary. And the restraint felt more dangerous than any advance would have been, because I could see the want in his eyes every time he looked at me, could feel the tension in his body when we accidentally brushed against each other, could sense the iron control he was exercising, and found myself desperately wanting to shatter it. I'd catch him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking, his gray eyes dark with something that made my breath catch, and I'd lie awake at night in my new apartment thinking about what it would feel like to have those hands on me, that mouth on mine, that controlled power focused entirely on my pleasure. But he never made a move, never gave any indication beyond those heated looks that he wanted anything more than a competent manager. And I told myself it was better this way, safer, that getting involved with a man like Dante Russo was asking for heartbreak at best and danger at worst, that I needed to focus on Lily and this new life and building something stable instead of indulging in fantasies about a man who was so far out of my league we weren't even playing the same sport. That particular Friday night started like any other, with me staying late to close the restaurant, while the last of the staff filtered out, leaving me alone to do the final checks and set the alarm. A routine I'd performed dozens of times with Dante's security. A rotating cast of large, silent men who treated me with careful respect, waiting outside to escort me home. I was in the kitchen doing a final inventory check when I heard the door to Dante's office open, heard his footsteps on the stairs, and when I looked up, he was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. And even from across the room, I could see that something was wrong, could see the tension in his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes that suggested whatever had brought him here tonight wasn't business as usual. "You should go home," he said, and his voice was rougher than normal, edged with something dark that made my skin prickle with awareness and a fear I didn't fully understand. "What's wrong?" I asked, because 2 months of working for him had taught me to read his moods, had given me a map of his expressions and tones that I'd studied like a language I desperately wanted to speak. "Business," he said shortly, moving into the kitchen with that predatory grace he always carried, coming closer than was strictly necessary. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made me want to bury my face in his neck. "Nothing you need to worry about." But he didn't leave. Didn't walk away like he should have. and we stood there in the industrial kitchen with its stainless steel surfaces and hanging pots, the fluorescent lights harsh overhead. And the air between us felt thick with all the things we'd been carefully not saying for 2 months, all the want and need and desperate attraction we'd been pretending didn't exist. "You should stay away from me, Mara," he said, and his voice was almost pained, like the words were being dragged out of him against his will. "Probably," I agreed, because I wasn't going to pretend I didn't know what he meant, wasn't going to insult either of us by playing dumb. "I'm not a good man," he continued, and he was closer now. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. Close enough that I could see the silver flecks in the gray and the way his pupils had dilated. "I know," I said, and my voice came out breathier than I intended, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "I've done things that would make you hate me, things that would make you grab Lily and run and never look back," he said, and there was something almost like a warning in his tone, like he was giving me one last chance to be smart, to be safe, to choose self-preservation over this magnetic pull between us. "I know that too," I whispered, and I should have been stepping back, should have been putting distance between us, but instead I swayed forward, drawn by gravity or insanity or some combination of both. "Then why the fuck are you looking at me like that?" he demanded, and his control was fraying. I could see it in the tension of his jaw and the white-knuckled grip he had on the counter beside us. "Like what?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant, even though I could feel the heat in my own gaze, the want that I'd been trying so hard to hide. "Like you want me to ruin you," he said, and the words were almost a growl, rough and raw and desperate. The truth escaped before I could stop it, before I could think better of it, before common sense could reassert itself. "Maybe I do." Something snapped in him, some final thread of restraint giving way, and suddenly his hands were in my hair, and his mouth was on mine, and I was being pressed back against the counter with the kind of desperate hunger I'd only read about in books. And the kiss was everything I'd imagined, and nothing like I'd expected, because imagination couldn't capture the reality of Dante Russo Unleashed, couldn't convey the way he kissed like he was claiming me, possessing me, marking me as his with every stroke of his tongue and every bite of his teeth. My hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer even though there was no space left between us, and I heard myself make sounds I didn't recognize, desperate whimpering noises that should have embarrassed me but didn't, because he was making similar sounds, low groans that vibrated through his chest and into mine. His hands moved from my hair to my waist, lifting me onto the counter like I weighed nothing. Stepping between my legs, and the new angle let me feel exactly how much he wanted this, wanted me, and I wrapped my legs around his waist instinctively, pulling him impossibly closer, drowning in sensation and want and a need so profound it felt like it might consume me entirely. Then his phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the haze of lust like a bucket of ice water, and he pulled away from me with a curse that was creative and multilingual, his breathing harsh, his lips swollen from our kissing, his hair messed from my hands, and he looked at the caller ID and cursed again. Something vicious in Italian that I didn't understand, but that clearly conveyed extreme displeasure. "I need to handle something," he said, and his voice was wrecked, rough with arousal and frustration. "Go home, lock the door, don't open it for anyone except my security." Then he was gone, disappearing out the back entrance before I could respond, before I could ask what was wrong or if he was in danger or when I'd see him again, leaving me sitting on the kitchen counter with swollen lips and shaking hands and a body that was still humming with unfulfilled need. I should have listened to him, should have gone straight home to my apartment and my daughter and the safe, normal life I was trying to build, but something in his tone had frightened me. Some underlying current of violence and danger that made my instincts scream that he was walking into something bad, and I found myself unable to just go home and pretend everything was fine. So instead of being smart, instead of being safe, I did something monumentally stupid. I followed him, staying far enough back that his driver didn't notice my car, tailing him through the city streets to a part of town I didn't recognize, an industrial area full of abandoned warehouses and empty lots that looked like the kind of place where bad things happened and nobody asked questions. His car pulled up to a warehouse that looked like it had been condemned years ago, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti, and I parked several blocks away and approached on foot. My heart pounding, my phone clutched in my hand, already regretting this decision but unable to turn back because what if he needed help? What if he was in danger? What if something happened to him and I could have prevented it? I found a broken window and peered inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold and my heart stop, and every instinct I possessed scream at me to run, to get away, to pretend I'd never seen this. Dante was surrounded by 5 men, all of them armed, and even in the dim light filtering through the broken windows, I could see the blood running down the side of his face from a cut on his temple, could see the tension in his body that suggested he was hurt, but still dangerous, still calculating, still looking for an opening. The man who was clearly the leader, expensive suit, cold smile, the bearing of someone who wielded power and enjoyed wielding it cruelly, was circling Dante like a shark. And when he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the empty warehouse. "The great Dante Russo finally brought low," he said, and there was satisfaction in his tone that made my skin crawl. "Do you know how long I've waited for this moment? How many years I've planned for the day when I could make you kneel?" "Fuck you, Carmine," Dante replied. And even injured and outnumbered, he sounded dangerous, like a caged predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Then Carmine's phone buzzed, and he looked at it and smiled. A terrible smile that made dread pool in my stomach like ice water. And he turned the phone to show Dante something that made every muscle in Dante's body go rigid with fury. "Your little pet and her daughter," Carmine said, and my blood turned to ice because he was talking about me, about Lily, about my baby girl. "Cute kid. Would be a shame if something happened to her, if she ended up as collateral damage in our little war." I watched Dante transform, watched something cold and lethal take over his expression, watched him become something other than human, something primal and violent and absolutely terrifying. "Touch her, even think about her, and I will end you in ways that will make you beg for death," Dante said. And his voice was so cold, so utterly devoid of anything resembling mercy, that even I shivered from my hiding place. "Bold words for a man about to die," Carmine said, raising his gun to point it at Dante's head. And I made a decision in that moment, a stupid, reckless, absolutely insane decision that would either save us all or get us all killed. I stepped out from my hiding place, my phone clutched in my hand where I'd already dialed 911 and left the line open, and I called out with a confidence I absolutely did not feel. "I don't think so." Every head in that warehouse turned toward me, and Dante's expression when he saw me was pure fury mixed with terror, and he started toward me shouting, "What the fuck are you doing here? Run, Mara, run now!" But I'd already seen the play, had already spotted Dante's gun sitting on a nearby table where they'd clearly confiscated it, and I was moving before I could think better of it. Running toward that table while Carmine's men were still processing my presence, still trying to figure out if I was a threat or just a stupid woman who'd wandered into the wrong place. I grabbed the gun, heavier than I expected, cold and lethal in my hands, and I spun and pointed it at Carmine, and I saw his expression shift from amusement to surprise to calculation. And I pulled the trigger before he could make a decision, the recoil nearly knocking me backward, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, and I watched Carmine grab his shoulder where my bullet had torn through muscle and bone, watched him stumble backward, watched blood bloom across his expensive shirt. Then everything was chaos and violence and noise, Dante breaking free from his captors with a roar of pure rage, moving with a brutal efficiency that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. And I watched him kill 2 men with his bare hands, watched him break one man's neck with a twist that was almost casual, watched him drive his fist through another man's throat with enough force that I heard bones crack. And I should have been horrified, should have been screaming, should have been running for my life, but instead I felt safe, felt protected, felt like as long as Dante was standing between me and danger, nothing in the world could hurt me. The sound of sirens in the distance meant my 911 call was bringing help, and Dante's men, who had apparently been on their way because he'd called them before the kiss, before everything had gone to hell, burst through the doors with guns drawn, and suddenly we had the advantage, and Carmine and his remaining men were stumbling toward their cars, leaving their dead and wounded behind, disappearing into the night like the cowards they were. Dante grabbed my hand with fingers that were slick with blood. Not his blood, I realized with a strange calm that suggested I was probably in shock. And he pulled me toward his car, and his driver was there, and we were speeding away from the warehouse before the police could arrive, before I could be connected to the scene, before anyone could ask questions about what a restaurant manager was doing at a mob hit. He didn't speak until we were miles away, pulling into an empty parking lot behind a closed shopping center, and when he turned to me, his eyes were blazing with fury and fear and something else I couldn't name. "You could have been killed," he shouted, and his voice was ragged, raw with emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. "What the fuck were you thinking following me there?" "That I wasn't going to let you die," I shouted back, adrenaline and terror and relief all crashing through me at once, making my voice shake and my hands tremble. "Why?" he demanded, grabbing my shoulders, and his grip was almost bruising, desperate. "Why would you risk yourself for me? Why would you walk into danger when you have Lily to think about?" The truth tore out of me like it had been waiting for this exact moment, like it had been building for 2 months and could no longer be contained. "Because I love you, you idiot!" The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, broken only by our harsh breathing and the distant sound of traffic. And Dante stared at me like I'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand, like my words were something he needed to process and couldn't quite comprehend. Then he pulled me across the center console into his lap, and his mouth found mine with a desperation that made our earlier kiss seem tame by comparison. And he was kissing me like I was oxygen, and he was drowning. Like I was the only thing keeping him alive. And I kissed him back with equal fervor, equal need, equal desperation. "Say it again," he demanded against my lips, and his hands were everywhere, touching me like he needed to confirm I was real, that I was safe, that I was his. "I love you," I said, and the words felt like freedom and fear and everything in between. "You shouldn't," he said, but his hands were tangling in my hair, pulling me closer, contradicting his words with his actions. "Too late," I whispered, and then there were no more words because he was kissing me again, and his hands were working at the buttons of my shirt, and I was tugging at his belt, and we came together right there in his car, with a desperate urgency that left no room for gentleness or hesitation. And it was raw and passionate and perfect in a way that made my heart ache. Afterward, we sat in his car, my head on his shoulder, his arms around me, and the reality of what had just happened, all of it, the warehouse and the violence and the confession and the sex, started to settle over us like a weight. "You're mine now, Mara," he said. And it wasn't a question or even really a statement. It was a claim, a declaration, a promise and a threat all wrapped up in 4 words. No going back. "I don't want to go back," I said, and I meant it. Even though I knew this decision was going to change everything, even though I knew loving a man like Dante Russo came with a price I couldn't yet calculate. He took me to his penthouse, a space I'd never seen before, and it was everything I'd expected. Expensive and modern and beautiful, but also cold and impersonal, like a hotel room rather than a home, except for one thing that made my heart crack open in my chest. A single crayon drawing stuck to his refrigerator with a magnet. The picture Lily had made him that first morning. Faded now, but carefully preserved. And I realized this man who killed people and ran criminal enterprises and inspired fear in grown men had kept my daughter's artwork like it was precious. We made love again in his bed. Slower this time. Tender in a way that the car hadn't allowed, and afterward he held me like I might disappear. And in the darkness he told me things he'd never told anyone. About his mother who'd died trying to escape his father's world. About the violence that had shaped him. About the empire he'd built on blood and fear and ruthless ambition. And I listened and didn't judge and loved him more for trusting me with his darkness. "I can't promise I'll be good for you," he said, his voice rough in the darkness, his hand tracing patterns on my bare skin. "I don't need good," I replied, turning in his arms to look at him, to see his face in the dim light filtering through his windows. "I need you. I'll keep you safe. Both of you, I swear it on my life," he said, and the intensity in his voice made it clear this was a vow, a sacred promise that he would die before breaking. "I know," I said, and I did know, could feel the truth of it in every touch, every look, every word. For the first time, he said the words I'd been desperate to hear. "I love you, Mara. God help us both, but I fucking love you." We fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for a few hours I let myself believe that maybe this could work. That maybe love was enough to bridge the gap between his world and mine. That maybe we could build something real and lasting despite the violence and danger that surrounded him. But Sunday morning shattered that illusion when his phone buzzed and his entire body went rigid with a tension that made my blood run cold. And when I asked what was wrong, he showed me a photo that made my heart stop and my world tilt sideways. A picture of Lily at her preschool, playing on the playground, completely unaware that someone was watching her, photographing her, targeting her. The message below the photo was simple and terrifying. "Cute kid. Would be a shame if something happened to her." I watched the man I loved transform into someone else entirely. Something cold and lethal and absolutely terrifying. Watched every soft edge he'd shown me disappear behind a wall of ice and calculation and barely controlled violence. And when he said in a voice that allowed no argument, "Pack a bag. You and Lily are disappearing until this is over," I knew with absolute certainty that our fairy tale was about to become a nightmare, and all I could do was hold on and pray we survived it. They say the devil can't find redemption, that once you've crossed certain lines and spilled enough blood and built your kingdom on the bones of your enemies, there's no path back to the light. No way to wash your hands clean no matter how hard you scrub or how many prayers you whisper into the darkness. But they never met a devil in love. Never saw what happens when a man who spent his entire life taking finally finds something worth protecting more than his empire, more than his pride, more than his very life. And when you threaten what a devil loves, well, that's when heaven and hell go to war and the world burns in the space between. The plan Dante laid out in the hours before dawn was simultaneously brilliant and suicidal. The kind of strategy that could only come from a man who'd spent decades playing chess with human lives and understood that sometimes the only way to win was to sacrifice your king, to offer yourself up as bait and trust that the people around you loved you enough to spring the trap before it closed around your throat. He would meet Sergei at the location specified, an abandoned art auction house on the waterfront, where the Russian had apparently been planning to expand his legitimate business interests. And he would go armed but outnumbered, would walk into what was clearly a trap with his eyes open and his acceptance complete. But what Sergei didn't know was that the FBI would be there too, that Dante had already made his deal with the federal prosecutor, had already turned over the first batch of evidence in exchange for their cooperation in taking down the Bratva, and that this meeting would either end with Sergei in custody and Dante on his way to minimum security, or with all of them dead, and the city drowning in the violence that would follow. I wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to convince him that there had to be another option, that walking into certain danger when we'd just found each other was the cruelest kind of irony. But I could see in his eyes that this was the only way, that every other path led to years of running and hiding and looking over our shoulders, and at least this way there was a chance, however slim, that we could actually have the future we'd been promised, that our children could grow up without fear, that the cycle of violence could finally, mercifully, end. "I need you to do something for me," Dante said as the sun was starting to paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, and we were still in that cathedral that had witnessed our lovemaking and our promises, still tangled in each other like we could prevent the dawn from coming if we just held on tight enough. "Anything," I said, and I meant it. Would have done anything he asked in that moment because loving someone means being willing to bleed for them, to sacrifice for them, to trust them even when every rational part of your brain is screaming that this is insane. "Take Lily and go to the safe house in Wisconsin, the one Marco told you about, and stay there until this is over," he said, and his hands were in my hair, tilting my face up so I had to look at him, had to see the desperation and love and fear in his eyes. "Don't come to the auction house. Don't try to help. Don't do anything except keep yourself and our children safe, because if this goes wrong, if Sergei wins, you're the only thing that matters. You're the only part of me that's worth saving." I wanted to promise, wanted to give him the peace of mind that would come from knowing I'd obey. But we both knew I was lying, even as I nodded, even as I whispered "okay" against his lips, because I'd already proven that I couldn't stay away when he was in danger, couldn't sit safely on the sidelines while the man I loved walked into hell. And some part of him must have known it too, because his kiss tasted like goodbye, and acceptance, and resigned fear. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of activity and preparation, of Dante making phone calls and meeting with his remaining loyal men, the ones who hadn't been killed or arrested or turned traitor, while I packed bags for Lily and myself with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, my mind already working through the logistics of how I could get to that auction house, how I could be there without putting myself directly in the line of fire, because I refused to let Dante face this alone even if my presence was more symbolic than practical. Marco came to collect us in the early evening, his face grim with the knowledge of what was coming, and he drove us to the Wisconsin safe house in silence, while Lily chattered in the back seat about the adventure we were having, blissfully unaware that her world was balanced on a knife's edge, that by tomorrow she might have lost the only figure she'd ever known before she even really understood what it meant to have one. The safe house was exactly what it sounded like. A cabin in the woods surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, with enough supplies to last weeks and security measures that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to approach without being detected. And I tucked Lily into bed and read her stories until she fell asleep, and then I made the phone call that would either save us or destroy everything. "I need your help," I said when Jessica answered, my best friend who'd stood by me through every disaster and triumph, who knew me well enough to hear the desperation in my voice without me having to explain. "Whatever you need," she said immediately, because that's what real friendship sounds like, unconditional and immediate and asking no questions until after the crisis has passed. "I need you to come stay with Lily," I said, giving her the address and the security codes that would let her pass the guards. "I need you to keep her safe for the next 24 hours, no matter what happens, no matter what you hear on the news, and if I don't come back—" "Don't," Jessica interrupted, and her voice was fierce with the kind of love that transcends romance and speaks to the bonds we choose rather than the ones we're born with. "Don't you dare talk like that. Don't you dare give up before you've even fought." But I made her promise anyway. Made her swear that she would take care of Lily and the baby I was carrying if the worst happened. And when she arrived 2 hours later, I held her tight enough to bruise and whispered thank you into her hair. And then I was gone, driving through the night toward Chicago with my heart in my throat and prayers on my lips to a God I wasn't sure was listening. The auction house was exactly as Dante had described it. A beautiful old building that had once hosted the city's elite as they bid obscene amounts of money on paintings and sculptures, now abandoned and decaying, its windows dark and its doors chained. But I knew those chains wouldn't stop what was coming. Knew that inside those walls the fate of everyone I loved was being decided. I parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot. My phone clutched in one hand, with 911 already dialed and waiting, and I found a service entrance that had been left unlocked, whether deliberately or through negligence I couldn't tell. and I slipped inside like a ghost. Like a woman who no longer cared about her own safety, because the only thing that mattered was being there, being present for whatever came next. The main gallery was a cavernous space with soaring ceilings and walls that had once held masterpieces, but now held only shadows and dust. And I pressed myself against a pillar in the balcony overlooking the floor below, and I watched as Dante walked in through the main entrance with 2 of his men flanking him. Watched as Sergei Volkov materialized from the darkness with at least a dozen armed Russians, and the numerical disadvantage was so stark it made my breath catch, because this wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution dressed up as a meeting. "Russo," Sergei said, and his voice carried in the empty space, thick with accent and satisfaction, and the particular cruelty of men who enjoy watching others suffer. "So good of you to come, and alone as requested. Well, almost alone. Though I suppose 2 bodyguards are acceptable when you're walking to your death." "Let's skip the posturing, Volkov," Dante replied, and his voice was steady and cold and showed no fear, even though he had to know the odds were impossibly stacked against him. "You wanted me here. I'm here, so either kill me or tell me what you actually want." What Sergei wanted, it turned out, was spectacle and humiliation, and the complete destruction of everything Dante had built. Wanted him to kneel and beg, and renounce his empire in front of witnesses before being executed like a dog in the street. And I watched Dante's jaw clench as he listened to the terms. Watched him calculate odds and outcomes with the quick mind that had made him so dangerous for so long. And I saw the exact moment he decided that he'd rather die standing than live kneeling. Saw him reach for the gun at his waist even though it was suicide, even though he was outnumbered 6-1. But before he could draw, before the violence could explode and consume everything, the windows shattered inward, and suddenly the auction house was flooded with FBI agents in tactical gear, and I realized this had been the plan all along, that Dante had counted on Sergei's arrogance and need for theatrics, had timed the meeting for exactly when the federal raid would commence, and the Russians were being tackled and handcuffed and read their rights while Sergei stood in the center of the chaos, looking like a man who'd just watched his empire crumble in real time. I should have stayed hidden. Should have remained in my balcony perch and let the professionals handle the situation. But I saw one of Sergei's men, young and desperate, and clearly more afraid of failing his boss than of the FBI, raise his weapon and point it at Dante's back. And I was screaming a warning and running down the stairs before conscious thought could intervene. And I watched in horror as the gun fired and Dante spun and fell. Watched blood bloom across his white shirt like a terrible flower, and I was sliding to my knees beside him while FBI agents tackled the shooter, my hands pressing against the wound in his side, my voice breaking as I begged him to stay with me, to keep breathing, to not leave me now when we were so close to the future we'd fought for. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said, and his voice was weak, but his eyes were fierce and even bleeding and possibly dying. He was trying to protect me, trying to shield me with his body from the chaos still unfolding around us. "Where else would I be?" I replied, and tears were streaming down my face, mixing with his blood on my hands, and I could hear sirens approaching, could hear someone calling for paramedics, and I just kept pressure on the wound and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed for anything. The bullet had missed his vital organs by centimeters, close enough to be life-threatening but far enough to be survivable. And I rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital while he drifted in and out of consciousness, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength every time he surfaced. And the federal agents who accompanied us assured me that the deal was still in place, that Dante's cooperation had just taken down the largest Russian organized crime operation in the Midwest, and that the prosecutor was prepared to honor the agreement they'd made. 3 days later, I sat in a hospital room watching Dante sleep, his chest rising and falling with reassuring regularity, the monitors beeping their steady rhythm that spoke of life continuing despite everything. And when his eyes finally opened and focused on me, the smile that crossed his face was worth every terrifying moment that had led to this. "Hey," he said, and his voice was rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "Hey yourself," I replied. and I moved closer to take his hand, to feel the warmth of his skin and the pulse at his wrist that proved he was alive, that we'd survived. "The baby?" he asked, because of course that would be his first question, his first concern after confirming I was real and not a morphine-induced hallucination. "Fine," I assured him, placing his hand on my stomach even though there was nothing to feel yet except the promise of what was coming. "We're both fine, and Lily is safe with Jessica, and Sergei is in federal custody along with most of his organization, and you're going to be okay." The deal, when it was finalized, was better than we'd hoped. 3 years in minimum security, in exchange for testimony against not just the Russians, but 2 other crime families, and a network of corrupt officials. And the prosecutor had agreed to allow 1 final week before Dante had to surrender. 1 week for us to prepare, to say goodbye, to pretend we were a normal family, even though we'd never been normal and never would be. We spent that week at the compound with Lily, and Dante met his daughter properly for the first time since that colored drawing months ago, and I watched him play Tea Party and build block towers and read bedtime stories with the kind of gentle patience that made my heart ache. Watched him memorize her face and her laugh and the way she said "daddy" like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I took 1,000 pictures because these memories would have to sustain us through the years of separation ahead. On the last night before he had to surrender, after Lily had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed bear he'd given her, to remember me by until I come home, Dante and I lay tangled, in bed, his hand on my stomach where our son or daughter was growing, and we made plans for the future in whispers that felt like prayers. "When I get out, we'll get married on a beach somewhere quiet. Just us and the kids and maybe Jessica and Marco," he said, painting pictures with his words of a life I desperately wanted to believe in. "And then what?" I asked, because I needed the fantasy, needed to imagine past the separation to the reunion waiting on the other side. "Then we disappear," he said simply. "New names, new town, maybe somewhere warm where the kids can run on the beach and you can manage a restaurant that serves regular people regular food, and I can be whoever Sarah Matthews's husband is supposed to be instead of Dante Russo." "Dominic," I said, because the FBI had already given us our new identities, had shown us the documents that would transform us from who we were into who we'd pretend to be. "Dominic Matthews, former business consultant, father of 3, madly in love with his wife." "Not all of that's pretend," he said, pulling me closer, and we made love slowly and carefully, mindful of his healing wound and my early pregnancy, and it felt like sealing a covenant, like making promises that transcended names and identities and governments, like binding ourselves together in ways that prison walls couldn't separate. The morning he surrendered, I stood outside the federal courthouse with our lawyer and Marco, and I watched Dante walk up those steps in a suit that made him look like a businessman instead of a mob boss. And just before he went inside, he turned and looked at me, and across the distance I saw his lips move, forming words in Italian that I'd learned over our months together. "Ti amo per sempre." I love you forever. And then he was gone, disappearing into the building that would process him and transport him and lock him away from us for 3 endless years. The witness protection program moved fast, giving me 2 weeks to close out the life we'd built before relocating us to a small coastal town in Oregon, where nobody knew our names or our history, where I became Sarah Matthews, bookstore manager and single mother, and I gave birth to twin boys 7 months later in a hospital where Dante's name didn't appear on any paperwork, even though his DNA ran through their veins. I named them Michael and James, ordinary names for extraordinary children who had their father's gray eyes and my determination, and I raised them alongside Lily in a house 3 blocks from the ocean, and I built a life that was quiet and peaceful, and everything I'd never known I wanted. The years passed slowly and quickly in equal measure, marked by letters I wrote to Dante but couldn't send, by the journal I kept documenting every milestone he was missing, first words and first steps and first days of school, and by the stubborn hope that kept me going through the lonely nights when I wanted nothing more than to feel his arms around me, Lily grew into a beautiful 9-year-old who excelled at art and had inherited my tendency to care too much about everyone. And the twins were 4 and wild and constantly in motion. And people in town probably thought I was a widow or divorced. And I let them think whatever they wanted because the truth was too complicated to explain. I dated no one, despite well-meaning friends trying to set me up. Despite the lonely nights when I craved adult conversation and touch. Because I'd made a promise to wait, and I meant to keep it. And every day I crossed off on the calendar felt like one day closer to the reunion I dreamed about constantly. He got out 3 months early for good behavior, and I didn't know he was coming, because the rules of witness protection meant no contact, no warning, no preparation. So when I arrived at the bookstore early one Tuesday morning and found a man standing outside waiting for me, my first reaction was fear until I really looked and saw the gray eyes and the familiar scar through his eyebrow and the way he was looking at me like I was water, and he'd been dying of thirst. "I heard you might need help managing this place," Dante said. "No, Dominic. He was Dominic now, would be Dominic for the rest of our lives, and his voice was the same, still capable of making my knees weak and my heart race." "You're early," I managed to say, because my brain was short-circuiting. Because 3 years of waiting had just collapsed into this single moment, and I didn't know how to process it. "They said 6 months. Good behavior," he replied, and he was moving closer now, close enough that I could see the new lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his dark hair. Close enough that I could smell him and remember everything, and my hands were shaking as I unlocked the door, because I didn't trust myself not to throw myself at him in front of the whole town. We made it inside the bookstore before I broke, before I was in his arms and kissing him like I could make up for 3 years of separation in a single embrace, and he held me like I might disappear, like I was the most precious thing in the universe. And when we finally pulled apart, we were both crying and laughing and unable to form coherent sentences. "Our sons," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "I want to meet our boys." "They're at preschool," I said, checking my watch with hands that wouldn't steady. "But they get out at 3 and Lily gets home at 3:30, and tonight you can meet your children properly, all of them." We spent the day in that bookstore, talking and touching and reconnecting, and I told him everything he'd missed, and he told me about the hell of minimum security that still felt like prison no matter how cushy. And when 3 o'clock came, we drove together to pick up the twins, and I watched my 4-year-old sons meet their father for the first time, with the kind of wariness children have for strangers. But Dominic, was patient and gentle, getting down on their level and asking about their favorite colors and toys. And by the time we picked up Lily, they were showing him their action figures and demanding he come see their room. Lily recognized him immediately despite the years, her face lighting up with joy and memories, and she ran to him with complete trust and threw her arms around his neck. And I watched this man, who'd killed and conquered and built an empire, break down crying while holding our daughter, and I fell in love with him all over again in that moment. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep in the house that was now ours collectively, we sat on the back deck watching the ocean and holding hands like teenagers, and the silence between us was comfortable and full of promise. "Any regrets?" I asked, because I needed to know if the sacrifice had been worth it. If 3 years in prison had made him question whether a life with us was enough to compensate for everything he'd given up. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he said, and he pulled me close, tucking me against his side where I fit perfectly. "Only that I wasted so many years building an empire of violence when I could have been building this. A family, a real life, something actually worth protecting." "We found each other when we needed to," I said, repeating the words I'd told myself 1,000 times during the lonely nights. A wrong number at 3 a.m. that turned into the best right thing that ever happened to us. 1 year later, we got married on the beach behind our house, with just our children and Jessica and Marco, who'd also taken a deal and relocated under witness protection. And the ceremony was simple and perfect. And when Dominic said his vows in that voice that still made me shiver, promising to love and honor and protect for all the days of his life. I knew with absolute certainty that every terrifying moment, every sacrifice, every tear had been worth it to get us here. Our life in Oregon was everything we'd dreamed and nothing like we'd planned, full of school plays and soccer games and family dinners around a table that was always too small for all of us. And Dominic managed the bookstore with me while taking online classes in literature because he'd discovered a love of books during his incarceration. And we were happy in a way that felt almost revolutionary given where we'd started, given the violence and fear and impossible odds we'd overcome. Sometimes late at night when the children were asleep and we lay tangled in our bed listening to the ocean, Dominic would trace patterns on my skin and whisper thank you. And I'd ask what for, and his answer was always the same. For saving me. For loving me when I didn't deserve it. For giving me a reason to become someone better. But the truth was we'd saved each other, had pulled each other out of our respective darknesses. Me from the grinding poverty and loneliness that had been slowly crushing my spirit. Him from the violence and emptiness that had consumed everything human in him. And together we'd built something neither of us could have created alone. A life that was messy and beautiful and absolutely worth fighting for. They say you can't escape your past. That the things you've done and the choices you've made follow you like shadows no matter how far you run or how much you change. And maybe they're right. Maybe some part of Dante Russo still lives in Dominic Matthews. Maybe some echo of the violence and power still whispers in the quiet moments. But standing on our deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors while our children play in the sand below, and my husband's arms wrap around me from behind, I think maybe the point isn't escaping your past, but transforming it. Taking the broken pieces of who you were and building something new, something better, something that acknowledges the darkness while choosing the light. And as I fell asleep that night in the arms of the man who'd started as a dangerous stranger and become my whole world, our children safe in their beds down the hall, and our future stretching ahead, full of ordinary miracles and quiet joys, I understood that sometimes the wrong call really is exactly the right one. That sometimes love finds you in the darkest moments and transforms everything. And that redemption isn't about erasing what came before, but about having the courage to write a different ending. To choose hope over despair. To believe that even devils can learn to dance in the daylight if they find someone worth leaving the shadows for.